Yo, what's up chefs? In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to survive your first dungeon while also getting some gear and treasure along the way. I plan to cover pretty much all of the basics in this video, such as how to properly deal with mobs, some tips for looting, and even the different methods of extracting. Finally, I'm going to be doing this on a rogue, since I know it's probably one of the most popular classes, and one of the hardest classes to start out on as well. Let's hop into it. First things first, surviving your first dungeon actually begins before you even queue up into a match. I'm going to recommend you head over to the class tab and then the perk and skill section, and if it's your first time playing the class, you'll probably want to give everything in here a little once over to familiarize yourself with the options your class provides. Then you're just going to want to make sure you have one perk equipped. Ideally, this should be something that enhances your damage or helps you clear PvE. So for rogue, I went with jokester, but if you're playing fighter, you might want something like sword mastery. Then you're going to want to make sure you have two skills equipped, whatever makes the most sense to you. So for rogue, I went with rupture and cutthroat. Once you've got your perks and skills sorted, I'm going to recommend you head over to the squire and then the base gear tab. And this is going to be a way for you to customize your default loadout. To expand on that just a little bit, when you die, you'll automatically be equipped with whatever you set up on this tab. Do just want to quickly add that they are making frequent updates to the squire, so things might be a little bit different depending on when you watch the video, but the premise should still be the same. First up, I'm going to recommend you equip whatever pair of boots your squire has to offer depending on your class. So for rogue, that's going to be heavy boots. You just left click them and they get added. Next, I'm going to recommend you get some consumables. The way I like to do this is I like to move my torches over to my second set of belt slots, which is by default bound to 4. Then I just left click the consumables one by one, which automatically slots them to my first set of belt slots, which is by default bound to 3. The only other thing I'd recommend for rogue is getting a loot, which is going to allow you to break crates inside the dungeon. Currently, rogue has no other way to break crates other than a loot, so this is definitely something you want to get added. After that, you just click set base gear and equip base gear, and as you can see, all of these items get added to my character. At this point, you're going to be ready to hop into your first match, and if you're going in solo, I'm going to definitely recommend you stick to the Goblin caves to start out with, so that's what I'm going to be playing as well. I'll catch you guys once I'm in game. Hopping into the dungeon, and I spawned in the top right corner of the map. I'm showing this with a screenshot of an interactive map you can find online, and if you've got a second monitor or even your phone, I cannot stress enough how valuable using one of these is to be able to eventually learn the map in its entirety by heart. This is obviously optional, but anybody coming from Tarkov probably knows how important using one of these interactive maps is when you're just starting out. Moving past that though, I quickly dispatched the mummy before taking a moment to break some of these pots. You'll find a lot of these scattered throughout the maps in different shapes and sizes, and they almost always drop loot, particularly treasure or utility items such as consumables and throwing knives. In normals, they don't tend to drop the best loot, but as you increase the difficulty of the dungeon, such as doing high roller or even going to the high roller hell in crypts, or the ice abyss on the frost mountain, the loot is certainly worth taking the time to break them for. After dealing with that second mummy and breaking a few more pots, I move over to a section of fire traps because I know there's a valuable chest behind them. Dealing with these traps is relatively simple as you just need to dodge the fire. However, the fire traps are quite rare and aren't found in many spots throughout the different maps. But these little demons here, called wall spikes, can be very common in different sections of the maps. There's no particular way to deal with them other than knowing where they are, which is where learning the hard way or using the interactive map comes into play. Then once you know their location, you can simply crouch under them or jump over them depending on their height. Up next, I've got some bats to deal with, and these are quite easy to kill as they always do a little scream once they get close to you, and you can usually kill them during it. However, if not, then they only have one attack, which is a little forwards dash, which can be baited out by getting close to them and then moving either left or right to dodge. The axe skeleton, on the other hand, is one of the most notoriously hated mobs in the game by many players and is quite difficult to get the hang of compared to most other mobs. It has two different attacks. One is an overhead lunge, which must be dodged by either going left or right. and usually cannot be dodged by running away, specifically once you start to fight the more difficult variants of the mob, such as the elite or nightmare versions, which move and attack much faster than the normal one, and really punish you for not knowing the correct way to deal with each attack. The other attack is a horizontal slash, which needs to be baited out and then backed away from to dodge. You will not have time to attack the skeleton until after they have performed that attack. Here I've got a spider pot to deal with, which will continuously keep spawning spiders up to a maximum of 3. So the best way to deal with these is to avoid killing the spiders and to first jump on top of the pot, which will keep you safe, and then break the pot with your weapon, at which point then you can kill the spiders. It's worth noting that these pots can also be broken with almost any projectile from range, such as arrows from a bow, throwing knives, etc, etc. Which can be very useful for certain spider pots that are hard to get to or are protected by other mobs. And at this point, I think it's probably a good time to cover the basics of dealing with mobs in PvE. There are a large variety of critters and creatures that you'll encounter in the dungeons, so this breakdown won't be perfectly applicable to all of them, but it will serve you well against almost 100% of normal difficulty mobs, and even the vast majority of higher difficulty ones as well. There are a number of videos already out on YouTube though that go into detail for some of the special monsters and mini-bosses you might encounter in Hell or in special locations of the dungeons, which I recommend checking those out. However, as for the general approach you should take to dealing with most mobs, it is as follows. Start off by aggroing the mob and waiting for them to approach you, or close the distance yourself and effectively chest bump them. This will bait them into making an attack. As soon as you've chest bumped them, you want to immediately turn 90 degrees to the right and hold your D key to move away from them, or 90 degrees to the left and hold your A key to move away. Especially when starting out, you can begin by chest bumping them and then holding S while looking at the mob to move away, but you suffer a very large movement speed penalty for holding S and backpedaling, so to speak. So, whether it be for dealing with mobs in PvE, or fighting players in PvP, you are much better off turning away and strafing out of range with either A or D. For some mobs, such as the Zweihander Skelly I just fought, or the Spear Skeleton I'll fight in a minute, you can speed up the process of killing the mob by crouching and looking directly down for certain attacks. However, even these mobs can easily be killed with the general strategy I already provided. After dealing with that Spear Skelly, I end up looting something called a Royal Coffin, which are quite rare and only have one area they can spawn in on the Goblin Caves, which is in this little downstairs section I'm in now. But they are one of the highest quality chests you can interact with, so they are always worth grabbing if you know you're nearby one. Up next, we've got another notoriously hated mob by the community, which is the Bola Goblin. These are dealt with similarly to most ranged mobs, which I'll go over in a minute once I get to an archer, but they are a bit particular because they'll start slinging their bola around over their head and somewhat randomly choose when to throw it. So you'll want to aggro them and then just start strafing left or right until they throw it, which will make it miss, and then you can take your turn to go in for some attacks. Here we have a health shrine which spawn in predetermined spots throughout the map, and as expected they will heal you for a very large amount, almost always getting you back to full HP unless you're playing a very tanky class and missing most of your HP bar. Following that, we have an archer goblin, which is dealt with the same way you deal with most ranged mobs, which is waiting for them to shoot and then moving left or right before taking your turn to attack. Same thing can be done for the goblin mages, as you'll see in just a moment. Here we have a spike trap, which can be dealt with in a number of ways. The most obvious is to just jump over one of the corners if that's possible. However, many of them are positioned to where that's pretty difficult, so another way to deal with them is to throw a torch on it to trigger the trap, and then as soon as the spikes recede, run over it, and then jump when you're about halfway across. The timing on this is a little tricky and will take some practice. You can also trigger the trap yourself without a torch by kind of tiptoeing on it, and then doing the same method, which I showcase whenever I come back over it in a minute. The gated stairway I was just pointing at is known as a static extract, and as the name implies, these are predetermined locations around the map that allow you to extract. The Goblin Caves has 4 to be specific. They will open up at a random point roughly 3/4 of the way through the match, and then can only be used by one player, allowing them to escape the dungeon without the use of a blue portal, which is the more standard way to escape that you'll see me use later in the raid. Alright, pause. This is really important. One day after recording this video, Iron Mace actually added a number of additional static extracts to the Goblin Caves, and removed the zone/swarm mechanic entirely, which I wanted to cover really quick and provide some footage so you know what to look out for before the rest of this run plays out. To start off with the zone and swarm, these have both been removed/replaced, so you can now venture around the map throughout the entire duration of the game as you please. However, a little bit over halfway through the raid, the entire Goblin Caves will start shaking every once in a while, doing damage to all players still within the raid. The frequency at which the map shakes ramps up as time goes on, doing damage to everyone more frequently. As for the changes to extracting, they added a number of additional static extracts in the form of ropes hanging from the ceiling that you can climb to escape, as well as a number of static blue portal spawns around the map, and finally an elevator that comes and goes many times throughout the match in the very center tile of the map. At this point, I've covered a lot of the fundamental aspects of surviving your first dungeon, so I'm going to start fast forwarding through certain sections to get to additional topics just a little bit quicker. Moving on, I've made my way to the direct center tile of the map, where I encounter a player, and if you're just looking to extract, which is what I recommend when starting out, then usually you can befriend people by doing some funny emotes or the universal friendly gesture of crouch spamming to one another, and you can always use in-game voice in a pinch. It's also worth noting that you're much more likely to encounter players towards the center of most maps for a number of reasons, such as high density of loot or just easy access to other sections of the map. So if your goal is to avoid PvP at first, then you might want to stick to the edges when possible. However, if you're just looking to get your feet wet or have some fun, then you can opt to go for the PvP. But there is a fair bit of nuance when it comes to solo PvP, such as what matchups are good for your class, positioning, using ranged damage to your advantage, zone placement, and the list really goes on and on, which the person you fight against may or may not be well versed in already, so do so at your own risk. I'll be covering all of those topics and more in one of the future beginner guide videos though, so make sure to check that out if you're interested in securing an advantage against most players. There, I just ran by another player who was probably trying to chit chat about something, possibly to ambush me, or maybe trying to sell me car insurance. I'm not really sure. But I wasn't interested in whatever it was and decided to keep making my way around for more loot. This is where the loot, L-U-T-E, the instrument, comes in handy as it allows me to break this crate. Crates are usually very lucrative and worth breaking. They oftentimes will drop treasure and gear in good amounts and good quality, so I always recommend breaking them, similar to pots. Barrels, on the other hand, usually drop pretty poor quality items and never drop treasure, while also taking more time to break than crates and pots, so I wouldn't really recommend breaking barrels that often unless you have no gear and want to test your luck. At this point, the time left in the raid is running out, so I'm starting to make sure that I position myself within the circle so I can ensure that I have some blue portals to use for extraction. I also run into this poor fella who would probably benefit from watching this video since he died earlier in the match to a mummy. But he had a couple of extra goodies for me, which I always appreciate. This is a blue portal stone, which can be interacted with to open, you guessed it, a blue portal, which is the most common method of extracting on most maps except for the ice caves. They start spawning around 3/4 of the way through the match, and there's always a set number of them that spawn. They will also always spawn within the white circle on your map, so keep that in mind when looking for them. Although you may find ones that spawned previously outside of the white circle. And if you're really struggling to find one, then just remember that the final one will always spawn in a tiny little circle on the map, so you can know exactly where to look for it, which I'll show in just a minute. Here you can see, as indicated by the arrow pointing to the minimap, the tiny circle I mentioned where the final portal will spawn. This will usually spawn when there's just about 30 seconds left in the match though, so you'll want to make sure you are close by and ready to open it as soon as possible, because if you haven't extracted before the time runs out, then you will instantly take fatal damage from the storm and your run will be over with all your loot left to the void. To close out the raid, I just quickly opened an extra portal for anyone still in the dungeon that might need it before taking the other portal for myself and finishing off my successful run. Once you have successfully extracted, the first thing you should almost always do is head directly to the collector and sell all of your treasure items, which is the only thing he can buy. You'll want to be careful though, because some items he buys can end up being quest items that you may need in the future and might prefer to just throw those in your stash. Usually these are somewhat obvious items that don't look like treasure, such as grave essence, mimic teeth, moldy bread, rotten fluids, etc, etc. You can also find a list of quest items you'll need on Reddit or the wiki if you're interested in stashing them up in advance. Next up, I just take off all my green rarity items and things I'm not interested in keeping and sell those to a different merchant. The reason for this is because as of a few days before the wipe, you're restricted to playing normals up until you are level 20. You can only bring in white quality gear or below into normals. So any greens, blues, or better that you got during your run, you will either need to stash them or sell them, and this includes consumables, throwing weapons, and all that as well, up until you are level 20, at which point you can bring them into High Roller or join the Traders Guild to sell them on the marketplace. I wouldn't be surprised if this somewhat weird dynamic was changed on wipe day though, so just keep that in mind. But ultimately, for starting out, if you want to keep your stash organized, I would highly recommend immediately selling all of your treasure directly to the collector for gold, then buying gold coin purses from the treasurer to hold 50 gold per slot in your stash, and then only keep quest items and items that you have some reason to believe are particularly good that you could use in High Roller or sell on the market once you're level 20. There is going to be a video later in this beginner guide series that covers gear and stats, which will give you more than enough information on how to determine what gear is good and worth keeping and or selling, so make sure to check that out. Also, if people ask for it or are interested, I'll make a short video in regards to stash management and organization as well, because it can be a lot to deal with when starting out. Other than that though, in conclusion, we made just about 475 gold from the run, including the green items I sold, and it would have given us probably about 3 to 4 levels if this was a level 1 character. So definitely a really solid run for normals. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you have any questions you feel like I didn't answer in the video, be sure to drop them in the comments below. And last but not least, take it easy, chefs.